What if I told you that at the turn of the 20th century, you could buy a human baby through the mail? Not adopt one through proper channels, not take in an orphan through charitable means, but literally purchase an infant like you would order a piece of furniture from a catalog. And stranger still, what if the evidence of this trade was hiding in plain sight for over a century, printed on thousands of innocent-looking postcards that your great-grandmother might have sent to a friend? Before you dismiss this as sensationalist nonsense, let me show you something that will fundamentally change how you see the past. In the early 1900s, a peculiar genre of postcards exploded across Europe and America. At first glance, they seem whimsical, almost charming in their strangeness. Babies emerging from cabbage patches, infants hatching from giant eggs, children growing on mushrooms like some fairy tale illustration, storks delivering bundles in their beaks, airships and trains loaded with rows upon rows of swaddled newborns. We've been taught to see these as quirky Victorian humor, a quaint way of explaining reproduction to curious children. But when you start reading the actual text printed on these cards, something shifts. Something deeply unsettling reveals itself. The key phrase appears again and again, written in French across hundreds of these images. À vendre, for sale. Not as a joke, not as a metaphor, as a literal, commercial announcement. One postcard depicts an entire fairground scene under a banner reading "Modern Baby Bazaar." Below it, terms that could belong to any retail establishment of the era. Free entry, we fear no competition. Everything is for sale. And at the bottom, in bold letters, the most chilling line of all. We do not accept returns. This isn't a humorous aside. This is a business transaction being described with the cold efficiency of a merchant advertising their wares. Another card shows babies nestled among cabbages with an invitation that reads, "Choose." The little ones have just grown. The phrasing is deliberate. Grown, as if describing a crop ready for harvest, not human beings. These aren't children, they're products. But the height of this commercial operation appears on postcards where each infant has what can only be described as a resume. Children sit in baskets, and beneath each one, a caption designed to entice a buyer. I will be good. I won't wet the bed. I am cheerful. I will love you. I am cute. Read those phrases again. This is a product description. These are selling points meant to help a customer make an informed purchasing decision. And just like the bazaar card promised, there was a strict no-return policy once the transaction was complete. Look into the faces of the children on these postcards, and you'll notice something else. Many of them aren't smiling. Some are crying. Others look frightened or confused. In several images, children are literally locked in cages like animals at a market. The caption on one such card removes any remaining doubt about its purpose. Children for sale. Do you want a baby? This isn't art. This isn't folklore. This is a catalog. These postcards were advertisements for a system that treated human infants as commodities that could be cultivated, transported, and sold to the highest bidder, or to anyone willing to pay the listed price. Now, at this point, you might be thinking this is just some dark corner of history, an isolated scandal from a morally backward time. But here's where the story takes a turn that connects to something far larger and far stranger. Because at the exact same moment these baby-selling postcards were circulating by the thousands, something impossible was happening in the great cities of the world. Something that has been hiding in plain sight in every old photograph you've ever seen from the mid-19th century. Take a look at any daguerreotype or early photograph of a major city from the 1850s through the 1870s. Paris, London, St. Petersburg, New York, San Francisco. What you're about to notice, once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee. The cities are empty, not just quiet, not just less crowded than today. Completely, utterly, impossibly empty. You're looking at grand boulevards that stretch to the horizon without a single person walking them. Massive public squares designed to hold thousands, standing silent and deserted. Riverbanks and harbors, the very lifeblood of any functioning city, devoid of workers, merchants, or sailors. These aren't photographs taken at dawn or during some special cleared event. These are supposed to be snapshots of thriving metropolitan centers at the height of their power. Official history has a convenient explanation ready for this anomaly. They'll tell you it's a limitation of early camera technology. Exposure times were long, sometimes several minutes. So, any moving object would be blurred beyond recognition or wouldn't register on the plate at all. Only stationary objects like buildings could be captured clearly. This sounds reasonable until you think about what actually makes a city function. A city isn't just people rushing past. It's built on stationary elements that should be everywhere in these photographs, but aren't. Where are the market vendors who stand at their stalls for hours at a time? Where are the goods laid out on tables, the crates of merchandise, the barrels of food and drink? None of it is there. The markets are empty. What about transportation? Cities of that era ran on horses and carriages. Drivers would park at designated stands, waiting for passengers, sometimes for hours. The horses themselves would be tied to posts, standing still, drinking from troughs, eating from feed bags. Perfect subjects for long exposure photography. But we don't see a single horse, not one carriage waiting by the curb. The streets are bare. Every city needs constant maintenance. Firewood and coal for heating and cooking would be stacked against building walls. Sacks of provisions would be piled near doorways awaiting delivery. The basic clutter of daily life should be everywhere. Instead, the streets look scrubbed clean, sterile, as if they've been prepared for inspection rather than inhabited. But the absence of people and their daily activities is just the beginning of this mystery. If you shift your attention from the streets to the buildings themselves, the strangeness deepens into something that borders on the uncanny. Look at the windows. Thousands of windows in these photographs, and not a single one shows any sign of habitation. No curtains hanging in the frames, no lace drapes catching the light, not even a simple flower pot on a windowsill. The windows are just dark, empty rectangles staring out like the eye sockets of a skull. These aren't the windows of homes. They're the windows of abandoned structures. The balconies tell the same story. In any lived-in building, balconies become extensions of the home. People dry laundry on them, place chairs out for summer evenings, store items that don't fit inside. But in these old photographs, every balcony is immaculately empty. They're purely architectural features with no function, no use, no evidence that anyone has ever stepped onto them for even a moment. The cities don't just look abandoned. They look as though they were never truly inhabited in the first place. They have the quality of an elaborate movie set, meticulously constructed by master craftsmen who then walked away, leaving the buildings to stand empty and perfect, waiting for actors who never arrived. But if this evidence seems circumstantial, if you're still thinking there must be a rational explanation, then look up. Look at the roofs. Every one of these grand buildings is topped with dozens, sometimes hundreds of chimneys. The architecture of the era makes it clear that each apartment, each room, was heated individually. Fire was the heart of every dwelling. You cooked over it, you warmed yourself by it, and smoke rising from a chimney was as fundamental a sign of life as breath in a body. Not a single chimney in any of these photographs is producing smoke. Not one thin trail rising into the sky. Not one thick plume from a tower. Kitchen stove. The air above these cities is perfectly, impossibly clear. Now, you might argue these photos were taken on warm days when heating wasn't necessary, but cooking happened year-round. Food had to be prepared daily. And statistically, across thousands of photographs from dozens of cities over multiple decades, we should see smoke somewhere, from someone. But we don't. The silence is absolute. The chimneys are cold. The buildings are dead. These cities aren't sleeping. They're frozen in a state of suspended animation, as if their hearts stopped beating long ago, and no one has yet noticed or dared to speak the truth aloud. Against this backdrop of eerie emptiness, there are a few anomalies, tiny details that seem to contradict the overwhelming evidence of lifelessness, but which may actually make the mystery even deeper. In one photograph, you might spot a single window with its transom slightly open, a small gesture, as if someone inside felt stuffy and cracked it open for air. In another image from St. Petersburg, fountains are operating at full power. Water jets shoot into the sky, sparkling in the sun, splashing into granite bowls. The machinery is clearly working, the water pressure is maintained, but there's not a single person anywhere near them. No children playing in the spray, no couples strolling past, no one sitting on the benches to admire the spectacle. The fountains perform for an audience of ghosts. And then, in one photograph among hundreds, you might find it, a single, barely visible wisp of smoke rising from one chimney, so faint it could be mistaken for a defect on the photographic plate. But if it's real, it's the only proof across thousands of buildings that somewhere, in one room, a fire is burning. These glimmers might seem like hope, evidence that life existed after all. But consider what they actually represent. An open window in a city of sealed buildings, fountains running with no one to see them, one fire burning among thousands of cold hearths. These aren't signs of a functioning city. They're signs of something else. Perhaps a sanitation crew airing out buildings that have been sealed for decades. Perhaps engineers testing a newly repaired water system, capturing the moment for a report. Perhaps a single watchman assigned to guard an empty district, keeping one small fire lit in the vast frozen silence. These anomalies don't disprove the emptiness. They emphasize it. So now we have two impossible phenomena occurring at the exact same moment in history. On one hand, postcards advertising babies for sale circulating by the thousands, suggesting an industrial-scale operation in child trafficking. On the other hand, photographs proving that the world's greatest cities stood empty, their buildings intact but lifeless, their chimneys cold, their streets deserted. These two mysteries are not separate. They are two pieces of the same puzzle. And when you put them together, the picture that emerges is so disturbing that it explains why official history has worked so hard to keep these pieces apart. What if those empty cities needed to be filled? What if the photographs we're looking at document the period immediately after some catastrophic event depopulated the world? What if the babies on those postcards weren't being sold in some criminal underground operation, but were part of an official, systematic program to repopulate a planet that had been wiped nearly clean of human life? Let me take you back to 1816. The official records call it the year without a summer. History tells us the volcano Tambora erupted in Indonesia, throwing so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked sunlight across the northern hemisphere. Crops failed, temperatures plummeted, famine spread. But if you dig into European archives and chronicles that somehow escaped later revision, you find something history books don't mention. The darkness didn't last 1 year. It lasted 3. 3 years without proper sunlight. 3 years of frozen fields and dead harvests. 3 years of what we would call today a nuclear winter, though its cause remains debatable. The evidence is there if you look for it. Food prices increased tenfold in Europe. Riots broke out over bread. Mass migrations began as people fled the dying continent, hoping to find better conditions in America. But the same gray sky and cold awaited them there. The phenomenon was global. The northern hemisphere was gripped in ice. And here's where it gets interesting. In official Russian history, there are virtually no records from this period. It's as if the vast empire simply stopped documenting its existence. Supporters of the official narrative would say, if there are no records, nothing happened. But logic suggests otherwise. If Europe was freezing and America was freezing, what was happening in Russia with its already harsh climate? The absence of records might mean there was no one left to write them. Or it means what was happening was so catastrophic that later authorities deliberately destroyed the evidence. Think about what 3 years without summer means for an agricultural civilization. The first year, you survive on stored grain. The second year, those stores run out. By the third year, there's nothing left. No food, no hope, just the cold and the dark, and the slow realization that this might be the end. The first to die would be the animals. Horses, the foundation of all transportation and labor, require enormous amounts of feed. When the hay runs out and no new grass grows, you face a choice. Feed the horses your own dwindling food supply, or slaughter them. Eventually, the choice makes itself. And when the horses die, the circulatory system of civilization dies with them. Without horses, cities become islands. No goods can be transported between them. No messages can be sent. The roads, even if they weren't buried under unprecedented snowfall, become impassable. A cart drawn by a starving horse cannot move through meter-deep snow. The path must be cleared first. And over thousands of kilometers, this is impossible. Even today, with modern snowplows and equipment, a single major snowstorm can shut down highways for weeks. Imagine the 1800s, with no machinery, no fuel-powered vehicles, just shovels and human backs. St. Petersburg, the capital, would have known what was coming. Somewhere in the south, in regions like Rostov-on-Don, there might be grain reserves. But how do you get a message there? How do you organize a rescue caravan across more than 1,000 kilometers of winter wasteland? A courier on horseback, even with fresh mounts at relay stations, would take weeks in normal conditions. In an ice age, it becomes a suicide mission. And even if the courier somehow made it through, how would the grain return? The rivers, normally used for bulk transport, would be locked under unprecedented ice. The roads are gone. The horses are dead or dying. The cities found themselves in a trap with no escape, cut off from the world by walls of snow and ice that no human force could breach. Inside those frozen prisons, the next act of the tragedy unfolded with brutal inevitability. When the food runs out, civilization doesn't just decline, it collapses into something unrecognizable. Hunger is the great destroyer of morality. It erases social class, religious belief, and human decency. The first bastion to fall was gastronomic dignity. Things that were previously considered unfit for human consumption became precious. This is when recipes were born that would later, in times of plenty, be romanticized as delicacies. Frog legs, snails, cheese covered in thick mold. These aren't culinary innovations. They're evidence of desperation. The cats and dogs vanished first, taken by those quick enough and ruthless enough to catch them. Then the rats became prizes. But when even that ran out, humanity crossed the final threshold. In the catacombs beneath Paris, among the millions of bones stacked in neat rows, researchers have found evidence that still disturbs them today. On some human remains from this era, there are unmistakable marks left by human teeth. The strong organized into gangs, raiding food stores and the homes of the wealthy. The streets became battlegrounds where the right to survive was determined by force alone, and those who still had the strength to move made the only rational choice. They fled, not to other cities, which were just as doomed, but away from civilization entirely, into the forests. The forest, which had always seemed wild and dangerous, became the last refuge. There, at least, you could hunt what little game remained. You could find firewood to stave off the cold. Trees became more valuable than gold because they meant the difference between freezing and survival. A mass exodus began. The young and strong left, abandoning the elderly, the sick, and the children who couldn't make the journey. The cities rapidly filled with bodies. Bodies in cold apartments, bodies on snow-covered streets, bodies in public buildings, and there was no one left to bury them. Then, after 3 long years of darkness, the sun returned. The ice began to melt. But what should have been salvation brought something worse. Thousands of corpses, preserved by the frost, began to decompose all at once. The stench became unbearable. Meltwater mixed with the products of decay, poisoning wells and springs. Epidemics exploded. The plague, cholera, typhus. All the diseases that thrive on death and filth swept through what remained. Wild animals, drawn by the smell, became the new masters of the urban streets. It became impossible to live in these places. Even the few survivors who had hidden in the forests couldn't return. The cities had become gigantic burial grounds, toxic zones breeding disease. This is what the photographs captured. Not cities during some temporary lull, not streets on a quiet morning, but the moment of recovery, decades after the catastrophe, when the bodies had finally decomposed, when nature had done enough of the cleanup work, when it became just barely possible to consider returning. But even as the cities became physically habitable again, something else had been lost. Something even more fundamental than buildings or infrastructure. The great chain of human memory had been broken. In any catastrophe, the most vulnerable die first. The elderly, who carry the memories and wisdom of the past, and the very young, who represent the future. In this tragedy, both were wiped out almost completely. Every elderly person who died in a cold room was a library burned to the ground. They took with them knowledge of crafts, traditions, history, family lineages, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime, gone in silence, erased without record. The children who might have inherited that knowledge died as well, leaving a demographic void. The few children who somehow survived became a lost generation in the most literal sense. Orphaned, with no parents to teach them, no grandparents to tell them stories of the world before. They grew up not knowing who they were, what their family name meant, where their ancestors came from, or what the massive empty buildings around them had once been used for. These children were blank slates. Their memories began at the catastrophe, with nothing but nightmares and trauma before that point. They knew no history, no culture, no tradition. They were perfect subjects for shaping into whatever the new authorities wanted them to become. You could teach them anything. You could give them any history, any language, any belief system. They had nothing to compare it against. This phenomenon gave birth to a precise Russian expression that still exists today. Ivan, who doesn't remember his kinship. It's usually used as an insult, but it's actually a literal description of an entire generation. People who grew up without a past, without family memory, without roots. A society suffering from collective amnesia. And this is where those baby postcards finally make sense in the broader picture. The catastrophe had left cities standing but empty. It had left behind children with no parents and no past. It had created a need for population on a massive scale, and it had created a supply of blank slate humans who could be shaped, trained, and distributed wherever they were needed. Those postcards weren't evidence of some underground crime. They were part of an official system, a repopulation program operating in plain sight, disguised behind whimsical images and fairy tale metaphors. The cabbage patches weren't jokes. They were symbolic representations of where these children were being cultivated. The storks weren't delivering babies from heaven. They were couriers in a logistics network. The trains and airships loaded with infants weren't fantasy. They were documentation of the actual transportation infrastructure being used to distribute human resources across the continent. The phrase that appears on so many cards, repopulation, tells you exactly what the program was called. These weren't adoptions in the modern sense. This was the systematic redistribution of humanity to fill empty territories and restore civilization. The orphanages that sprang up by the hundreds all over the world weren't charitable responses to some vague increase in poverty. They were processing centers, intake facilities where children were gathered, documented, and prepared for redistribution. Some postcards even show children in what look like training camps or with well-dressed officials, suggesting they weren't just being placed randomly, but prepared for specific roles. Workers for the factories, farmers for the fields, perhaps even soldiers for the armies of the new order. The scale of this operation is difficult to grasp. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of children being moved around the globe. And the fact that it was done openly, through the mail, on postcards that people sent to friends and family, tells you something crucial. This wasn't considered wrong at the time. This was normal. This was how the world worked after the reset. The photographs of empty cities and the postcards of babies for sale are two sides of the same historical moment. One shows the aftermath of depopulation, the other shows the mechanism of repopulation. Together, they reveal a chapter of history that has been carefully obscured, not by hiding the evidence, but by convincing us to interpret it differently, to see tragedy as quaintness, to see documentation as whimsy, to see a systematic program as scattered criminal acts. Any government that came to power after such a catastrophe would have every reason to erase it from memory. To admit that the great capitals had died out from cold and starvation, that civilization had regressed to cannibalism, that the cities were corpse-filled graveyards for decades, would be to admit the complete failure of the old order. It would raise too many questions about legitimacy, about what really happened, about who was responsible. Far easier to create a new narrative, to tell stories of gradual growth, of industrial revolution, lifting people out of poverty, of scientific progress marching steadily forward, to turn the empty cities into tales of photography's limitations, to turn the child distribution system into either a forgotten curiosity or a criminal aberration rather than an official policy, to invent a continuous history that papers over the gap, the reset, the moment when the world nearly ended and had to be rebuilt from orphaned children who remembered nothing. This is why those old photographs and postcards are so precious. They're the few pieces of evidence that escaped the historical revision. They're proof that our civilization is much younger than we've been told, that it arose not from gradual progress but from sudden catastrophe, and that the world we live in now was built by people who didn't understand what they had inherited. We are not the descendants of an unbroken chain of human civilization stretching back thousands of years. We are the heirs of survivors, of blank slate children raised in the ruins, who were taught a new history to replace the one that was lost. The majestic buildings we preserve as heritage sites weren't built by our recent ancestors. They were found by them, already standing, already ancient, already half buried in mud from whatever catastrophe had swept the globe. The question isn't whether a reset happened. The photographs and postcards make that undeniable. The question is what caused it, how much was lost, and whether the same forces that nearly erased humanity once might be preparing to do it again. And perhaps most importantly, why does the official story work so hard to keep us from asking these questions? What are we not supposed to remember? What truth about our past and possibly our future is being hidden behind the convenient lies of gradual progress and photographic limitations? The evidence has been in front of us all along, in every old photograph of an empty city, in every strange postcard our great-grandmothers might have sent, decorated with babies and cabbages and storks in postal uniforms. The story they tell, when you finally see it, is one of loss, survival, and a truth too uncomfortable for the history books. We live in a world that was reset, and the proof has been hiding in plain sight for over a century, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see it.